Okay, everybody, please do sit down. We really need to get going. Could you please take your seats? Thanks.
You bet.
Larry Yochai, then me, then Eben.
I'm not sure what he said. I just
Yeah,
know he said I'm
you're
going.
perfect. That's all you needed to know. You're second.
Oh, we're still 15, 15, 15. I don't need that. You take
Okay, thank you. We are continuing with the third subject area that we've been focusing on, the public domain. This is really the public domain in the network, the roles of the public domain or of the commons, ideas that may or may not be different, as we've already discussed on the first day, in three different layers. And our panelists today are going to explore that in different ways. Once again, a remarkable set of panelists. In the order of which they're going to present, we have Larry Lessig, author of Code, also author, as I said last night, on November 6th, of The Future of Ideas, which has just been published, and a distinguished writer on these fields at Stanford. Yochai Benkler at NYU, whose work on the public domain, his article "Free as the Air," a series of other wonderful songs, titles that have followed. He's obviously a frustrated songwriter. We have "Free as the Air," we have "Siren Songs and Amish Children," and most recently we have Coase's Penguin, something in here, and Yochai is struggling, trying to get out. We also have Brian Cantwell Smith. I'm delighted to have Brian here in particular because Brian has just joined us here at Duke. He is the Kimberly Jenkins Professor of New Technologies at Duke. He used to be the principal scientist at Xerox PARC, which is, you may have heard of, a small little organization that works a little bit in technology, kind of on the fringe. And also was an adjunct professor of philosophy at Stanford, brings a fascinating perspective to all of this. And finally, we put him at the end because he's kind of shy and tends towards understatement. Eben Moglen, legal historian, agent provocateur, and general counsel to the Free Software Foundation, who's at Columbia. Thank you very much.
So I thought we should begin with a little acknowledgement of the virtue and perpetual love and happiness surrounded by Microsoft. So I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation here. So I've been struggling these past months to figure out whether what we're talking about is a huge idea or a tiny idea. Whether it's the sort of idea that is the beginning of what people use the word revolution to refer to, or a modification of extremes, which would be tinier and smaller and less important. And I want to talk this morning as if it's both, or pretend it's both, or argue to get you to see that you can see it either as small or big, and I'll start with small and then say something to make it seem big. I wrote a paper which is the core of the argument in the book that Jamie has now very kindly twice referenced in the conference. And I just want to begin by making sure that the core argument of this paper is before us, before I try to say whether we're talking about small ideas or big ideas. And I won't try to characterize my idea as small or big. I'll just use it as an introduction here. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, so yeah. Oh no, Microsoft's your friend. You have to understand. Sorry? Yeah, let me just, because I actually, the only reason I wanted to do this is that, well, I wanted to make fun of Microsoft, but I also actually had some quotes that I wanted you to see. And So we start with two ideas, which are fairly obvious ideas that we want to make sure we're all on the same page about. One is an idea about the nature of resources, and I'm just providing some definitional orientation here. I want to talk about resources as being free or controlled, and by controlled resources, I want to refer to either property, or in the sense of private property as a controlled resource, or a resource is controlled in the sense that the Soviet controlled resources when resources were controlled by the state. In either case, the relevant fact is there is an actor who, on potentially subjective grounds, can choose to grant access or not to a particular resource. Then the second idea here is the notion of free resources. And these are resources that are either completely free in the sense nobody attempts to control them, or in the sense that we've described here, are resources within a commons, meaning that the access to the resource is generally granted. This is the sense of that Stallman means when he talks about free in the sense of free speech, not free beer. That even if there's a charge, the charge is not the charge of the subjective property actor, but the charge of neutral access, which might be small, should be small. Of course, if that charge were so high, it could change the essence of what we are talking about as a commons into something like private property. But I just want to think of it as small right now. And the second idea is also familiar to you, the idea that we think of communication systems in layers, and here Yochai's work has been organized around this. We think of a physical, as Yochai calls it, the logical, and a content layer that together form the architecture of any communication system. And then against this picture, we have the idea of the internet, and we can think about the internet broken into these layers, and then we have the following observation about the nature of resources within these layers. The first is that the physical layer here is typically controlled. The machines and the wires are owned by private parties or by the government or by institutions, so they're not free in the sense that anybody has a necessary right to them, but they are controlled as I've described them. The content layer, and here I mean both software and stuff that's served across this network, is both free and controlled. In the sense that I mean free, the open source and free software of the network is free stuff, and much of the content on web pages should be free, not worth much anyway. But there's also, of course, as we've seen by this tyranny of lawsuits, a ton of stuff which is effectively controlled. So there's a mix here between free and controlled. But the claim that is critical to understanding the internet, and the claim that's at the foundation of the argument of the paper, is that we should understand the code layer. I've renamed Yochai's layer into code here for completely self-interested reasons. The code layer here is free, which means it sets up a resource which is equally open to all, and it does that because the original architects of the network embraced a principle called end-to-end design. And what end-to-end here must mean is that intelligence in the networks is placed at the edge or at the ends of the networks, and the network itself remains as simple, or as David Eisenberg calls it, stupid as possible. And the consequence of this, not claiming that this is intended necessarily, but the consequence of this is to produce what we can, I think, accurately call an innovation commons at the code layer, which means because the network can't discriminate, because the network hasn't the power to choose which stuff is allowed and which stuff is not allowed at the original design of the network as an end-to-end network, it creates a resource which is equally open to all to innovate around. And innovation then is not controlled in the sense that I meant controlled resources. It's free, and that's the essence of what I think formed the extraordinary innovation and creativity of the network. That's the first idea. So here's now the sense in which what we might be talking about is very small. So there's this guy, Michael Powell. He's got some famous relatives. He's also head of the FCC. Michael Powell gave a speech on October 25th about broadband technologies. And Michael Powell has some very predictable views about broadband and some interesting views about broadband, and the predictable ones are not the interesting ones. But I want to talk about both views, Michael Powell. So Powell has a view about the physical layer of the network and what it should look like in the future. And Powell's view is we have to liberate the physical layer from heavy-handed regulation. The free market must govern the physical layer, which means for cable and even telecom, we've got to remove the heavy hand of government regulation, which has so far stifled innovation. Now, you might think that's surprising. Thought we were all remarking about the extraordinary explosion of innovation, but no, this has stifled the innovation, and so laissez-faire should govern the physical layer. And we have this is the quote from this speech: when someone advocates regulatory regimes for broadband that look like, smell like, feel like common carriage, scream at them, which is a helpful way to have a conversation about this, but scream at them, tell them you have no idea of the cost at stake. Of course, I say, well, what about the benefit? But no, he's interested in the cost at stake, which he says inhibits innovation. So, with respect to the physical layer, Powell's message is give the property owners perfect control over their property. Don't condition it by limitations imposed by regulators. Then Powell had something interesting to say about the content layer. Powell was trying to explain why content in broadband had not been developed quickly enough. And he says, much of what is holding broadband content back is caused by copyright holders trying to protect their goods in a digitized environment, in other words, perfect reproduction world. Stimulating content creation might involve a re-examination of the copyright laws. Arguably, VCRs would not be widely available today if Universal Studios had one infringement case in Sony 1984. Now, read this over and over again and recognize what's just happened here. The head of the FCC, and this never would have happened in a Democratic administration, right? The head of the FCC has said, maybe it's the perfect control over copyrighted materials that is inhibiting innovation and development in the context of broadband. We might have to re-examine that, limit the extent of control that copyright gives to these owners. And if we re-examined that, that might in fact recreate some kind of innovation here, because as he points out, and we all say over and over again, what would have happened if the Sony Betamax case had been decided differently? 2 days after this, I was on a panel with a guy from Sony, Yair Landau. Sony has a view about broadband. And Sony's view about broadband can be divided between its view about the content layer and the code layer. And its view about broadband and the content layer is Powell is the devil. When I mentioned Powell's name, he went crazy, Landau, on this panel, saying Powell has no respect for intellectual property. He's questioning the protection we give to intellectual property and questioning it because he doesn't understand that we've got to have perfect control of intellectual property. We're going to have absolute, extensive control in order to create the proper incentives for people to invent. So the view of Sony at the content layer is more control at the content layer. But later on in this conversation, we got Landau to talk about what he actually does. So what Landau does at Sony is he's developing technologies to enable it so that you can stream movies to your computer. Okay? And they've developed all these special technologies that pay-per-view movies that you can get on your computer. He loves this idea. He's finding it hard to deploy. As he described one event, he didn't name the names to my great frustration, but he described one meeting he had with certain cable interests, where after demonstrating the system that would make it so you could stream video to computers, you know, cable companies make lots of money streaming video to television sets. What about to computers? The cable company told Landau, we will shut down broadband before we ever allow this technology on our lines. And Landau's reaction was, this is absurd. They're inhibiting innovation, those cable companies. And what we ought to be doing is finding ways to limit them in their efforts to limit innovation, right? So Landau's view about the physical layer was we needed less control at the physical layer. Right? So put these two guys together, right? Powell at the content layer is less control, at the physical layer, more control. Landau at the content layer is more control, at the physical layer, less control. Putting them together shows that though they don't yet understand what each other are saying, there's at least a common consensus that too much control over what we call property might inhibit innovation in certain contexts. And the common ground here is that we can get people to see how, we're not against, it's not like Powell's against property, and it's certainly not against Landau is against property, but we can get them to see how perfect protection is inhibiting innovation, and we've got to find ways to limit perfect protection. Now, once you recognize, I mean, it's fun to make fun of the two of them for not seeing the other side and sort of arguing so extremely about the part that they want to increase collection, but once you put them together, that's the sense in which you begin to wonder, is this just a small idea that we're talking about? Is it just this tiny little modification? Don't you see how you really believe property needs to be limited in some sense? And so just understand how, in the sense that you don't get yet, it needs to be limited. There are two consequences to this. One comes from yesterday, where it makes it easy for us to see where we will understand there to be a problem, right? So Carrie Sherman got up yesterday and said all this stuff about how they were in favor of the internet. The internet's great, it's going to do all these wonderful things. Don't you see, we love the internet. And then as a throwaway, sort of 3/4 of the way through what he said, quote, you can't expect the labels to cannibalize their business. Which is why Yochai responded, exactly right. You can't expect them to cannibalize their business. Therefore, we need to cannibalize their business. Progress is all about old industries being cannibalized, and the question is, what's the quickest way to cannibalize here? So you can't trust them to do it. That's why we need to liberate the market to do it on its own. So that's the sense in which, for completely obvious reasons that Powell and Landau together should get in some sense, we have progress on what the future should hold, and that is, let's just make sure that the dinosaurs are not able to stop evolution towards mammals, right? We stop the power of the dinosaurs from stopping evolution. And I think what follows from that is the part of this debate where I am getting increasingly less popular about this, but the part that says, if that's all we're doing, let's resist talking about this in ways that sound traditionally left and right. Because the great opportunity here is that we can get people to see our points without them thinking that these are just leftist lunatic ideas, right? So the book, I learned my lesson in my first book, which had a last chapter titled What Declan Doesn't Get. The last chapter of this book is titled What Orrin Understands. And of course, Orrin Hatch is a hero in these debates. The two critical issues that have come up in the last 5 years, Microsoft and online music. He's not been some raging loony, at least on our side. But he has been someone who has seen the fundamental importance of balance on both issues and has insisted on skepticism to make sure the old can't take over the new. Okay, that's the sense in which this is just small ideas. Then I want to think about whether there are bigger ideas here. And the more I struggle with these debates and listen to people talk about them, not lawyers, but people, not that we're not people too, but in a very different sense, the more I realize that I think there's a more fundamental blindness at stake here that we've got to begin to find a rhetoric to resist. And this is a blindness about the nature of property and the way property functions in the context of ideas. So I come from California. California is an interestingly divided state. There's a north and there's a south in California. I come from the north, Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is a place which has flourished because of the free ideas of Silicon Valley. This is not a concept which was limited to the internet. Of course, for a long time, people have been commenting about the fact that creativity in Silicon Valley came from the fact that ideas and content could flow freely between companies. We believe in free ideas. That's what made Silicon Valley great. And we continue to develop technologies and implementations that also rest on free ideas, on the idea of free culture. In the south of California, a different idea reigns. They believe culture can be owned. In the South, they believe that the right to use or deploy culture depends upon you getting the permission of the culture owner, plantation owner, culture owner, plantation owner, culture owner, who decides, and by the fact of the way the market exists now, hoards an extraordinary amount of culture and chooses whether to license it based on whether they like the way you want to use it. Now, of course, they have a rhetoric for defending what they're doing. We're just, trying to make sure that the artists, slaves artists, have the best opportunity to market their ideas. But we can look at this and say, your concept of culture is different from ours. You think culture is owned. We think it should be free. Now, there's an obvious metaphor here and history to draw upon, and that's the idea of the free labor movement. Free labor, free culture. Because though it's taken, extraordinary efforts for us, and especially Richard Stallman and Eben, to go around and say, when I say free, I don't mean zero cost necessarily. I mean just free in the sense of free speech. Nobody in the free labor movement thought that when you said we want free labor, that meant that workers weren't supposed to be paid, right? Everybody got that the free labor movement was about not zero price, but freedom to move about as you choose, limitations on private control over private rights constructed through contract. That was the free labor movement. And the reason for this was not because they hated the idea of markets. You could have labor contracts. You could have 8-hour work days. You should be paid for those things. Well, actually, at that time, you could have 20-hour work days, whatever. But the concept here was enable limitations on these private rights. Now, it's that set of insights that we have to bring to this debate about culture. Culture, too, in exactly that sense, must be free. Not free in the sense of zero price necessarily, or that you get to steal anything you want. No, that's not the world. But limitations on private rights to enable the greatest flourishing of this kind of culture. Now, the reason this is so hard is that though I could, in a stylized way, divide North and South in California, each of us has the North and the South inside us. Ordinary Americans, all of us, can be flipped from one side to the other without even noticing it. Most Americans think Mickey Mouse should be owned by Disney for the rest of time, never even thinking, well, what about Victor Hugo's estate's complaints that they destroyed the Hunchback of Notre Dame because it was in the public domain and they could take it and do what they wish with it, right? We have this deep sense of all us believing, in some sense, the politics of the South and of the North. And what's got to happen is we've got to find a way to liberate this discourse from this confusion, to see the virtue in free culture without imagining it that's some lunacy that would say culture is not part of a creative process and can't be produced by both commercial and non-commercial entities. Now, if that's our message, then this does require something of a war. I hope it's a more civil war than the last one, but a war to reconstruct how these aspects of our life, this culture, is thought of, because though in many ways it's an unfair metaphor, and of course what's at stake is radically different, and the last civil war was serious, if I'm and this one's not, if I want to make the comparison. But for us, what is at stake is a future which would either be a future where creativity is decentralized among lots of people who can participate and transform, or a future where creativity is increasingly concentrated in the hands of actors who, it turns out, never let stuff fall into the public domain ever again. The technologies and the freedom that these technologies enable forces us to make this choice now, and it will require us outside of this room to reconstruct how ordinary people think about this thing which we have allowed them to refer to as intellectual property. It is property, sure, for those of us licensed to use that word. But for ordinary people, I think we need to think about the free in that property in the way that we learned and fought and defended the idea of the free in labor. Thank you very much.
So Jamie asked me to provide the boring relief on this panel. I actually don't want to talk about normative implications of anything. This morning, we will spend some time on it. I will get to spend some time on it in the afternoon. We'll all, I assume, spend time on it both now and later. What I want to do instead is suggest the possible emergence of a third mode of production of information and culture. And then we can talk about why we would care about this thing. Now, we get to talk about this because free software has shamed those who think about market and property-based production as the only way things can work. Shamed by winning at the core of the information economy. And that's really all I want to say largely about open source software or about free software now, because mostly what I want to do is use that victory to expand our vision of the maybe development of a third mode of production between markets and individuals interacting only in markets, and firms, individuals producing only in response to commands from managers. Something developing called peer production, the ability of peers in a decentralized fashion to collaborate to be productive. Now, if we think of a definition, I'd say peer production would refer to variously sized collections of individuals who effectively produce information goods or culture without price signals or managerial commands. That's the defining characteristic that makes it separate and potentially a new way of organizing production. Now, as it turns out, once you don't look only at free software, this is a ubiquitous phenomenon. Right? We spent in the morning talking about a community that has been peer producing the core of our knowledge environment on a peer production model. That is academic science. The web, the story of I go to Google and search. The web is a peer production mechanism whereby widely distributed individuals with very little need for coordination for a variety of reasons add increments. And when does the information product get created? When you plug a search request. You defining what you ask of this tremendous group to produce an information input for you. That is a peer production process. But what I'd like to focus on, and what I focus on this paper, Koza's Penguin, on, is in a sense more formalized and identifiable projects that don't fit either the firm model or the market model. And the thing to see, and what I tried to do in the first part of the paper, is show how this exists everywhere in the chain of information production, from content production through relevance and accreditation, and to distribution and value-added distribution. So an example actually in the paper that in some sense speaks to this morning's question of open source does or doesn't fit science. Of course it doesn't fit science entirely, but there's this project, NASA Click Workers, where tens of thousands of individuals, sometimes one-time players, sometimes repeat players, get access to maps of Mars and then sit down and, in a very simple, playful interface, mark craters. After 6 or 7 months of operation, they checked this against data that they had from a trained scientist working full-time, and they came to the conclusion that the mapping of craters was virtually indistinguishable in terms of the result. So content produced by tens of thousands of people working in their spare time, virtually indistinguishable from the scientist who is trained to do so. Not all information, not everything, and we'll need to think about why yes and why no, but possible. Then there's the question, but it's all junk. Well, for one, we all know that it's no junk as a matter of experience. Some junk, some not. But more formally, this requires us, in a sense, to look at how the specific characteristics that make things not junk, relevance and accreditation, can also get produced in a widely distributed peer-produced model. And here we have examples from the Open Directory project, from Slashdot. We have examples of commercial entities integrating distributed relevance production. Google, classic example, Amazon to some extent. The idea is, again, the function that used to be the function of the critic, the commentator, the talking head, the editor, can be distributed widely among thousands of users of Slashdot, so that some things that are more relevant float up, some things that are less relevant float down, some things that are not credible get commented on or float down. That particular separate function, separate from the content, too, can be widely distributed. And distribution. So we have at the physical level, we have Gnutella, Freenet. Those are some examples. But Project Gutenberg is a peer production of a distribution function of texts. One of my favorites in this is distributed proofreading, right? Project Gutenberg, you scan in texts, you put them online, they're available. Eben gets to read them on the plane without carrying books. Distributed proofreading aids this by setting up specific pages. Here's one page, you can proofread one page against the text. You come in, you proofread the one page, you submit it back, it's proofread. 8,500 pages being proofread a month by a couple of hundred volunteers, doing it largely in some portion of spare time or another. It's ubiquitous. And it's ubiquitous for each of the components that together make up something useful and interesting to read, hear, watch. Now, usually the response is, why on earth are people doing this? Also known as the incentives problem. Now, the incentives problem was presented to the open source software phenomenon. I think it's largely been answered by that literature. So Eben's answer was, we play and then create, or we're human and it is in our nature to create. And so it's an irrelevant question. Others have answered along the dimensions of, there are multiple reasons. Some of them hedonic, some of them reputation, some of them to build human capital, some of them to appropriate indirectly in various ways, some of them work for IBM, others of them are trying to get a reputation, all sorts of reasons that fit in the mind frame of what Eben called the econodwarf, people who only think that people are motivated by incentives. It turns out there are a lot of people who think that, and some of them have come up with answers for why you would do it. If one were to try to generalize this, you'd say two things. One, given a sufficiently large number of contributions, the incentives necessary to bring into contributions are trivial. Right? Enough people contributing small enough chunks to a project, all you need to answer is what is the incentive necessary for the small increment. And that's a trivial problem and is answered by all of these various arrangements, and some combination of people full-time paid by one person in order to get human capital in the firm, lots of people trying to get ahead, lots of people trying to play, is enough. This leads to a second proposition, which is that peer production is limited not by the total cost or complexity of a project, but by three factors. Modularity, which is to say how many can participate and how varied is the scope of investment. Granularity, which is to say what is the minimal investment necessary to participate, and the cost of integration. Whether something can or can't be done on a pure production model will be limited by one of those factors. The granularity is too large. If you need to sit down for 5 months and work one person with one mind, with one creativity, unlikely to be able to peer produce this. If it can be broken down, and when you try to look at collaborative novel writing, that's an example for what is and isn't working. And that's an interesting set of examples. So here's the question. Is the extravagant claim about an emerging mode of information production potentially sustainable? And in order to do that, and I won't go into the details too much here, but I do in the paper, I tried to take a couple of the most mainstream, or primarily the most mainstream conservative conception of firms and how they emerge, Coza's theory of the nature of the firm, and how firms emerge and what separates firms from markets. And I suggest that under certain conditions, you can have a parallel theory such that if you lower communication costs among people, and if you increase the salience of human capital in the production enterprise enough, what you will get is peer production. And the basic thesis is, just like firms and markets are separated in Coza's framework by a notion of transaction costs, I suggest there's a phenomenon called information opportunity costs. That is, different mode of organizations provide to the agents involved in them different ways of deciding how to act, reducing the uncertainty about different courses of action. Markets price different courses of action. Firms create an algorithm of where the statement comes from. And there's lossiness in each of these media. In particular, with regard to human capital, that's a highly variable input. So it's very hard to specify the time, the task, the mood, the raw talents, the particular context, the interactions between the people. These are things that are very hard to specify sufficiently to price well and to subject to managerial control. Instead, what you get with peer production is self-identification for tasks, a vast set of resources available for a vast set of agents, each to explore where they are now at 10 p.m., bored with the television, wanting to play, if it were, or where they are now in life, finishing reading whatever college text they're reading and wanting to play in something else, play or work or advance themselves or whatever it is that causes them to act. Identifying for themselves in small increments when it is the right thing to do to act. Now, if it's the case that the resources are freely available and people can move freely from project and resources and contribute in small increments, then this mode of production is a better mode of capturing this information about who are the best people for this particular set of resources, for a particular set of projects, now, at this minute, or 5 minute, or 10-minute increment. Now, this also has another nice characteristic that I won't go into, which is that there are economies of scale and scope, both to the set of agents and to the set of resources. So as you increase the set of agents and make them capable of acting on an increased set of resources, they are likely to join together to create more efficiently a larger set of projects. And essentially, one way in which both firms and markets limit uncertainty or produce information is by bounding sets of agents and sets of resources. And so you lose these economies of scale and economies of scope as a way of reducing uncertainty in this particular mode of production. And so the main mechanism of increasing the information quantity in a peer production model also captures economies of scale in terms of assignment of human resources to information resources. Two last things very quickly. One, when you get to a situation as we are now, where the capital cost of information production is getting lower, think huge studios versus computer and what you can do with them, where the communication costs are very low, where information inputs are a public good, the most salient remaining economic good involved in information and cultural production are human beings. So a mode of organization that is better at clearing human beings will have a substantial advantage under these conditions, which is to suggest why the same conceptions that gave us markets and firms will give us peer production when human capital becomes so salient. And the second point is the commons. So how does all this integration happen? Now, there's a lot to say about this, but I'll just name the specific strategies. One, these communities set up all sorts of ways in which collaborative efforts in other situations, and the commons literature is immensely valuable to sort of recognize this, and the common property regime literature. I got that right, didn't I? Formal rules, so the GPL, the GNU GPL, or the open access public library, licenses, formal rules for what can and can't be done to defect and in a sense appropriate the common value. Technological constraints, so /code, the code that runs /doc, has various ways in which it limits any individual's ability to appropriate the common standard. The story about Lambda-Mu and somebody trying to appropriate the storytelling by making other characters play roles they don't want to play. Social norms get developed and rules get set. Social norms are also a way of organizing behaviors in these kinds of decentralized mechanisms. Iterative peer production of integration, which is to say /code itself is open source, moderators themselves are moderated by other reviewers. The function of integration itself can be iteratively created. Mars Clickworkers tells us redundancy averaging out, and even when hierarchies or markets get reintroduced, there's no need to create a residual property right because the component of value that they add is sufficiently small that we have Red Hat participating in an integration function in a peer-produced model without needing to capture the entire residual property right. So there's room for markets and hierarchical arrangements within a framework of peer production without swallowing it.
I don't know a thing about the law, except that I know that not knowing a thing about the law is no defense. So you might think that undefended, I would be worried about what it is that everyone's been talking about here. But in fact, what I found unsettling, and this happens every time I cross interdisciplinary boundaries, which is pretty much what I do in life, isn't so much encountering the things I don't understand as encountering the things I do. Issues here of layered protocols, digital content security measures, databases, information, and so on and so forth. Here's the problem. Where I work is in the conceptual foundations, essentially, of computing and information. That is, the concepts in terms of which CS and IT practice are intelligible. And the main result, I guess, that I've come to after 30 years of work is to realize how little we understand there. Sure, we've got an explosive, irreverent, triumphalist practice, but the understanding on which it's based is still largely tacit, and the concepts that give voice to that understanding not ready for what computer scientists would say export necessarily to other fields. At least I'm not sure they're ready for export yet. In fact, as I've said in my calling card essentially for these 30 years, if your understanding rests on my understanding, you're in trouble. So three notions of IT, just to problematize this. The first two just by way of example. The third one's the one I want to concentrate on. The first is digitality, surely at the heart of a lot of what's going on. As of 5 a.m. this morning, there were 3,285 books on Amazon that had the word digital in their title. But digitality is deucedly recalcitrant to understanding. It's pretty clear what it's for. My favorite definition is from John Moglen, and I quote, "An engineering notion, root and branch, a practical method for coping with the vagaries and vicissitudes, the noise and drift of earthly existence. That is to say, digitality gives you a kind of stability. That's why we get perfect copying, right? You don't get unduly buffeted by the world's variation. What's odd, though, is that stability at the level we care about it isn't so much what digital content gives. What it gives is the ability to change it. You can update your website every 5 seconds. And in fact, in order to understand the impact of digitality, you have to understand as much how it gives us fluidity as how it gives us fixity. And if you start looking at fluidity, that starts to raise questions, which is if things change so easily, are they the same thing? Is it the same thing changed or a new thing? Sure enough, I'm a philosopher, Heraclitus and the flow of information. But this is going to have impacts on issues of content and issues of protection and so on and so forth as to what the identity of information is. Another issue is implementation. These layered stacks that we heard about, for example, in Larry's talk about physicality and then a level of code perhaps and content above it. But the thing is we can implement all kinds of levels on top of one another. TCP/IP may be a commons protocol, but on top of it, of course, one can implement protected, controlled protocols, streaming protocols, encryption standards, APIs, label sets, and XML, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of really tricky issues in implementation. But the thing I want to talk about here is the notion of information itself. There are theories of information. There are like 4 of them I talk about in my course. One of them, which is the most familiar, is tied to entropy, the physical substrate, quantum computing, and so on and so forth, came from Shannon Weaver. It's amazing to read Shannon and Weaver. Actually, Shannon knew perfectly well this wasn't a theory of information. Weaver was the snake oil salesman. It was quite a duo. What Shannon knew is this is a theory of information amount, right, of information quantity. But there are many other things that roughly in the English notion of information are in fact important, maybe in the commons notion. The most obvious one is information. The fact that information means something. If somebody comes in the door and says, look, I've got information that the Golden Gate Bridge was just hit and destroyed, what information does is that it's this amazing ability to grab your imagination and direct it towards things that are remote, far away in space and time. That fact is not theorized in the current theories of information. There are issues of concreteness. We've heard in the last 24 hours that information is virtual, not material, not physical. I'm actually not sure that's even right. I think that may be a myth that has been propagated on us. Another issue that's interesting to me is the issue of authority. Suppose, to continue, I don't know why I was having a violent imagination this morning. Suppose there's a huge crash, the lights goes out, the doors are blocked, we can't get out of here. Someone climbs through the window and comes back half an hour later and says, look, I've got some information. Now that information, in order to be information, can't be a mere hunch, right? It can't be a suspicion. It can't even be the result of impeccable logical reasoning. To be information among us, something has to have a certain kind of independent authority. And interestingly, in order to be information, it has to not have an author, right? In spite of the etymological similarity, the etymological relationship between that. In common parlance, that is, in the commons, information is something like a publicly accessible, contextually mobile, impersonal corpuscle of authoritative content. This reminds me of Jeff Nunberg's definition, one of my favorites. Information is what you get when you take a book by the spine and shake it so that all the words fall out. Now the question is, how do these notions of information that are part of our cultural heritage affect things, for example, on the web? Well, they affect it in enormously complicated ways. One conceit that I might be able to tell you, since I don't know too many of you all that well, is that I know the names of the authors of all of the books on my library shelves. But I'll tell you right away, there's one book I don't know the author of, and that's the dictionary. The dictionary, I know who published it, right? Oxford, Merriam-Webster, somebody like that. Why is it that I know the names Oxford, Merriam-Webster, and not the name of the lexicographer? It's because that's where the authority is invested, right? That's the locus of the authority that I'm interested in. Now, what if a large software company from the Northwest, say, were to put a different dictionary in their, say, productivity suite and define it as follows? 1, this is quality, right? Customer satisfaction. 2, that level beyond which a customer has no legal recourse for complaint. Now, is this information about the word quality? It might be copyrightable because there's probably no prior art for the word to mean so little. this issue of authority ties into the fourth issue of information that our current notions don't deal with, which has to do with information identity. This came up when I mentioned digitality. What is it for notions of information to be the same? This, too, we have no theory of, although, of course, we decide it all the time in tenure cases, in plagiarism, is this the same proof or a different one? Is this the same piece of music or a different one? What I want to do, we don't have time here, is say that identity of information at the level that it matters to us is a higher level, emergent, more abstract property than mere patterns of bits in the underlying implementing string. There was some discussion yesterday about whether someone could write a program to identify content, right, which is essentially to establish identity. And if I were in any other context than this one, I would say that I would go to court to argue that, in fact, nobody can write such a program, not until AI is solved. Nobody could write the book that, with respect to Mark Hostler's, the fair use book, identified all of the sources that, in fact, had been cribbed, right? That can't be done algorithmically. Suppose you've got a song, it's in B, I transpose it into B flat. Is it a new song? Probably not, but the bits are going to be different. What if I transpose it into a minor key, and so on and so forth? Okay, so content in this sense is, number one, more abstract than the pattern of bits. And secondly, which is really where I want to drive to, its identity is bound up with its authority. That tying those two together is actually the main point I want to make. What's interesting is that when you realize that it's tied up with authority, it's not obvious to me that information is in fact not subtractable, as we've heard. If everybody uses the dictionary in the Office suite or makes up their own, then it's not clear that Merriam-Webster's entry is any longer actually going to be information. That is, qua information, it may in fact, qua information in this normative sense, it may in fact be subtracted by other proposals. Okay, so anyway, these are the sorts of issues that I wrestle with, that I think computational practice has, in fact, rich, tacit, enormously interesting, decentralized expertise, but not yet formulated in a ready-for-export way. And of course, there are issues on which social practice policy and so on and so forth, if I understand anything about what you folks do, depend. Now, you might conclude from that what I want to argue is that there should be a lot of thick, rich dialogue between our various fields, and I believe that's absolutely, absolutely true. But I want to up the ante before I close with saying that what's actually going on, I think, is even more important than anything I've said so far would suggest. The point is simple. These issues about information, abstraction, materiality, content, and so on and so forth aren't just relevant to the technology that we're talking about. They're not just subject matter internal. They also bear directly, in some ways they're even constitutive of the very theoretical discourse we use to talk about issues of technology, patent rights, discourse, and so on and so forth. For example, think about what we heard about yesterday, an idea versus its expression in David Nimmer's talk. Form, theory, and content, right, on no less an authority than Raymond Carver. The fact below, the expression, the idea above, I think that was in Jamie's talk. A relationship between content, artifact, and facility in Eleanor Ostrom's talk. Issues of black and white distinctions, Rosemary Coombe in her injunction to explore middle regions. Black and white concepts is just digitality at a more abstract level. The point is that the conceptual frame in which we understand rights, technology, and so on and so forth is also issues of information form and so on and so forth, right? Sometimes I'm jealous of Ptolemy or Kepler and so on and so forth, right? The theory was written with quill and parchment, and the model was made of brass, and the subject matter was hot and a long way away, and no one was going to get them confused. In this field, our theories, our models, and our subject matters are all interplays of concrete, dynamic, communicative symbol systems, and it leads to terminal confusion. So the point is, this stuff is reflexive. We have to understand these things not only in terms of understanding the technology, but we have to understand these things in terms of understanding our understanding of that technology. What's interesting about that is if the rest of the university, if you push on notions of, well, what is the difference between an idea and an expression, say, or what's the difference between form and content, and you look in linguistics, you look in philosophy, you look in a variety of fields, they tend to point to computer science. And once again, I get queasy. Although this is an interesting university to speak from because there's another place one can look. Which is literary criticism and post-structuralist discourse and stuff. Now, lots of people in the sciences think this stuff is inexorable dreck. What did we hear yesterday? Specious harangue. I actually think it's relevant, but it's relevant with respect to the point I want to close on. I was with some of these people at a dinner party once, and they were talking about how there's endless plays of signifiers or whatever, right? In that language, there's no author meaning, and things are only meant by communities and stuff. And I said, look, suppose I make a racist remark, and you say to me, look, Brian, that's not okay. I don't get to defend myself by saying, look, I didn't say that. The whole dinner table said it. Right? The thing that's interesting about individual people is that we are the locus of a certain kind of normative responsibility. And in fact, I'm going to conclude with this. In fact, I think that's what the notion of person is. It's not that we have a prior notion of person such that we find that, in fact, people are normative agents. It's that what it is to be a person is, in fact, a normative agent. Basically, that's what I think is true about information content if we realize that its identity is more abstract than a pattern of string of bits. We don't have an antecedent notion of information content with respect to which to define the rights, obligations, liabilities, and so on. Rather, in the case of information, what's going to happen is, just in the case of person, the issues of rights, obligations, liabilities, and so on and so forth are going to figure in our determination of what counts as the same information. Jamie said technology is changing the terms of the debate, affecting the issues conceptual frame in terms of which to think about public and private domain. What I'm saying is issues of how we think about the public and private domain are going to, in fact, affect our notion of information content, which means I've got you. Now, my understanding is going to rest on yours. Because you're the guys who know about this, right? Not me. But look, the real line is we're in this boat together. Science has forever believed that we need to work hard to find terms, concepts, and ideas in terms of which to find the world intelligible. With Jamie, I believe we need to find terms, concepts, and ideas in terms of which to render the world intelligible. That is to say, to render it the way that the words say it, as well as, of course, productive, habitable, and humane. That, it seems to me, is the point of his recruiting of the environmental example. The constitution of a notion of environment affected, in fact, the world that we live in. That's going to be true with respect to these normative notions of information. In a way, it's kind of Talmudic. Words, concepts, and ideas have the power to summon. If we're going to take responsibility for being stewards of the world, we're going to have to work together to forge foundational ideas that will summon a world worth wanting. Thank you.
Well, so in one tiny little respect, I'm not like Carrie Sherman. I know what I'm doing here. Spectre is haunting the world. The specter of free information. Where are the advocates of freedom in the new digital society who have not been stigmatized as pirates, anarchists, communists? Have we not seen that most of those hurling the epithets were merely thieves in power, whose talk of intellectual property was merely a justification for retaining unjustifiable privileges in a world irrevocably changing? But all the powers of globalism acknowledge that the movement for free information is itself a power. And it is high time that we should meet the nursery tale of the specter of free information with a manifesto of our own. I didn't actually come here to give that speech this morning. Do that another time. But I am very grateful to Larry for pointing out that there are certain contradictions inherent in capitalism, and for suggesting that Lord and Master, freeman and slave, master and journeyman, they have all conducted their fight, oppressor and oppressed, sometimes covertly, sometimes overtly, often leading to revolution and the downfall of social systems. In other words, I'm here this morning to remind you that you can't just make some compromises. You gotta keep the real end in view. The real end is freedom. Now, what Larry has to say this morning is, I must say, uncharacteristically optimistic. I didn't hear him say that we were going to fail. I didn't hear him say that freedom was doomed. I heard him say there was going to be a civil war, which was good news. I heard him say it was going to be a civil war, which is even better news. I wish the guys on the other side thought that as firmly as he does. Now, I'm planning to fight clean, but I'm not planning to give up. It's nice that victory has been announced for the part of this little game that I've been playing. I don't think it is actually victory yet, you understand. I think the real war's just about to start. But we had a lot of practice thinking about how we were going to fight it in all the years when they weren't even noticing yet how dangerous we were. And I think we're ready, minus the few $1 billion that they're going to spend on the other side. I think Larry is right to notice that the contradictions are catching the Allies up already. It's one of those cases where even before you begin bombing the children, the coalition is falling apart. And that's good news. And I'm very much in favor of it. Some Powell or other is messing up the war. I do think also that it is important to note that that division among layers, as Brian says, is merely conventional. And you can move that line around a lot, both ways. If you keep the code free, you can do things with it that affect the physical layer of the net, that affect the content layer of the net, that affect the meaning of the net. And Yochai is right in pointing out just how easy that is to do, how little you need. I think the big news is that the incentives argument is already dying. Even before they get ready to fight that enormously expensive war against us to protect that argument, it is dying. People are not believing in it anymore. Creation, my friends, is Brownian motion. It does not matter why, it does not matter when, it does not matter how, and it does not matter in which direction. It just happens. The trick is to keep it from unhappening in some orderly, systematic way for the benefit of a few. Resist the resistance, I said once. I still mean it. Everything's going to flow in the wires. Just don't let them notch up the resistance at the ends. So Larry's right. It's at the ends that it happens. We're going to have to take at least a piece of it out of the pipes. We're going to have to put it in the air. We are going to have to generate a network that nobody owns. And in order to do that, we are going to have to rely in substantial measure on carriers that nobody owns either. We are going to have to build a layer of communication which consists of all of us routing one another's traffic completely without any place where anybody bottlenecks anything. In that network, John Gilmore, my old friend, is right that censorship is failure and gets routed around, but so is property failure that gets routed around. So is control failure that gets routed around. I'm not suggesting that we can just betake ourselves to the air and fly away from all this mess. The wires underneath are really important too, but we will not get that piece of the story straight unless we liberate enough bandwidth that has no carriers to make equality. The great moral question of the 21st century is this. If all culture, all information, all art, all music, all useful knowledge has zero marginal cost and can be given to everybody everywhere at the same price that it can be made in the first place, why is it ever moral to exclude anyone from anything? If you could manufacture enough food to feed the world by simply pressing a button as many times as you needed lamb chops, there would be no moral case in any system of moral thinking of which I am aware for allowing anyone ever to starve. And we have to make sure that as we deal with all the complexities in each of the little corners of this world where we are, each of the little quantum effects of this and that propinquity to this or that previously large gravitational force, that we don't forget that the moral question is before our eyes the whole time. In the world towards which we are moving, all of the traditional relations that support ignorance are radically unjust, and we have an obligation to fight against them. But that's okay. It's fun, believe me. It won't hurt. I've been having a good time. What I think we need to understand then, and I believe that Yochai has suggested how we might begin understanding it, is that even in a culture where people are accustomed to go home at night and sit on the couch, it is possible to make a revolution. A few minutes at a time, sometimes, not always, but certainly without coercion. Because underneath, and this was pointed out yesterday in the discussion about the difference between how economists and lawyers think about property, underneath this is the fact that lawyers, when they think about property, think about exclusion. They think about coercion. They think about forcing arrangements. That's what property is from the lawyer's point of view. For. You can't have this unless you give me that first. What we are moving towards in general is non-coercive arrangements for making and distributing things. And here I need to pick up a stitch of Yochai's just for a moment. He's absolutely right that when you want to assess whether peers can do things, you want to look at the modularity and granularity of what it is you want them to do. But he focuses only on the word production. Distribution is modular and very granular. And all distribution of lightweight, zero marginal cost goods can be done by peers. Indeed, as I have otherwise argued in my usual unsystematic and completely non-formal way, distribution by peers achieves maximum theoretical efficiency, what I have called the 6 degrees of separation principle. Here, give it to anybody you think ought to have it. It propagates at the closest possible, shortest possible paths through the social net and arrives everywhere in the least time. Remember that most of these property theorists, these exclusionists on the other side, are distributors. They don't make anything. They say they make something, but the work-for-hire principle is all that allows them to maintain that claim. They distribute stuff they say is theirs. You remember Mr. Sherman's difficulty on this point. Not because they actually thought it up, but because they paid money to people who thought it up. They are actually simply buying and selling the right to distribute, and they have no business to exist. They have no business to exist. So we have to do something to take their existence away from them. Fortunately, it's not complicated. We just have to ignore them. Then they will make trouble. Then they will attempt to coerce people. Then they will put 15-year-olds in jail. Then they will arrest Russians in America. Then they will do various egregious things. Then we will fight. Then they will beat us. Then we will win. Because, of course, the more they disintermediate, the more there's only them and us. Oh, do you remember capitalism, the bourgeois? They made everything much simpler. The class structure got narrower. It came down only to those two exclusive groups, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Everything got simpler. Those old social structures, they collapsed. Everything solid melts into air, you will recall. So in the end, it's just them and us. They're people, we're people, eyeball to eyeball. They've got a laptop, we've got a laptop. Doesn't look good for them, does it? As long as I've got a laptop, they're in trouble. They've got to take it away from me. They've got to put something inside it that says it's not mine anymore. And you just give me a neural interface, and they got to get even closer inside. And the world's not going to let them do that. Because for that, people will fight. Larry says free labor. Free soil, you recall, went along with that, so I say free bandwidth. Free men went along with that. I say free minds. Don't give up until we're free. Don't give up because you have a compromise that's okay now. We can ride a little closer to the front of the bus than we used to. Freedom. Freedom. Now. Thank you.
Well, if the panelists had said anything provocative, we might have questions, but here's the problem. We could sit here for many hours discussing what we just heard, but we have some constraints which Eben has not yet rendered entirely impermeable, which have not yet been all that is solid melted into air. And unfortunately, those constraints are the constraints of time.